They evaluated him like livestock, but valued him like a fighter 37. Roman pounds of muscle and bone meticulously recorded in wax tablets alongside inventories of oil and wine. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the forum, listing his qualities like a farmer selling cattle. Strong shoulders, unmarred skin teeth in tactile age, estimated at 16, though no one had bothered to ask. The morning sun filtered through the awnings above the slave market, casting sharp shadows over faces that had long learned to avoid the eyes of prospective buyers. The air thickened with the scent of unwashed bodies' olive oil from nearby shops, and the sharp tang of fear that no incense could conceal. Chains rattled with each movement, a cruel percussion that underscored the business of human trade. Marcus Crassus Aquila stood at the front, arms folded, calculating. The boy's frame hinted at Germanic origins, broad through the chest, long-limbed with bone density that suggested durability in the arena. Aquila ran his fingers along the slave's forearms, checking for old fractures and testing the joint's flexibility. This was not cruelty. This was quality control. Bidding started at 50, denarii steadily climbing, as other trainers recognized what Aquila had seen potential. A Thracian gladiator school owner raised his hand. A Syrian merchant gestured from the back, but Aquila had deeper pockets and clearer vision. He saw more than muscle and bone. He saw months of profitable entertainment, roaring crowds and coins flowing into his pockets. At 120 denarii, the gavel dropped. The transaction was complete before the echo even faded. A scribe made the entry, one male slave, Germanic origin, property of Marcus Crassus Aquila, to be trained for arena combat. The ink dried quickly under the Roman heat, and the boy, still nameless, was led to the corner where the branding was done. The iron glowed orange, the mark of Aquila's gladiator school, searing his skin. The sizzling flesh mixed with the morning's other smells. He did not cry out. Perhaps he understood that silence was survival's first lesson. Shackles were fastened around his ankles, connected by a chain just long enough to allow walking, but too short for running. The metal was smooth from years of use. A legacy of captivity passed from one slave to the next. As he was led away from the forum to the gladiator school that would reshape him, the market continued. Bodies were examined, priced, and sold without pause for individual tragedy. They called it training preparation for a life where choice was eliminated. The boy who had costed 20 denarii was assigned sleeping space number 47 in a dormitory thick with the scent of sweat and fear. The brand on his shoulder still oozed fluid that stained the rough wool tunic he was given. He learned quickly that pain was a form of currency here. The more you could endure without crying out, the more respect you gained from men who had been broken and rebuilt to Roman specifications. The gladiator school, spread across 3 acres just outside Rome's walls, was surrounded by 15-foot-high stone barriers. Inside the courtyard was divided into sections: weapons training, physical conditioning, medical treatment, and sleeping quarters that housed 200 men in spaces meant for half that number. The walls bore the stains of sweat, blood, and time, each mark a testament to the transformations that occurred human to performer. Dawn broke with the sounds of wooden swords striking shields, grunts of men pushing their bodies past natural limits, and the constant stream of commands shouted in Latin, Greek, and broken Germanic. The boy learned quickly that understanding was unnecessary. Only response mattered. When the trainers pointed, he moved. When they gestured, he copied. Language became irrelevant, for every stimulus demanded the same thing: immediate compliance. His diet was calculated with precision: barley porridge for carbs, dried beans for protein, olive oil for fat, and wine mixed with water for hydration. The portions were measured to build muscle without excess, to create strength without independent thought. Hunger was a constant companion, but never enough to weaken performance. The trainers had learned that a man who fights for food fights harder than one who fights for freedom. Among the slaves, a rigid hierarchy emerged, artificial but absolute. Those who had survived multiple arena appearances wore leather braces, signaling their status. New arrivals learned to defer, to seek approval, to compete for the smallest acknowledgement from their betters. The boys soon realized that the veteran gladiators were often more brutal in their discipline than the Roman trainers themselves. Cruelty, when spread throughout the ranks, became self-sustaining. Physical conditioning consumed 6 hours a day. The boy's hands, once soft from whatever life he had known before, developed calluses that cracked and bled before hardening into permanent ridges. His shoulders widened from lifting stone weights, his legs thickened from endless combat drills. Each change in his body was catalogued by the trainers who adjusted his regimen with the precision of engineers constructing a siege engine. The gladius became an extension of his arm honed through repetition that bordered on ritual. 10,000 thrusts against straw targets, 10,000 blocks with the wooden shield, 10,000 footwork drills in the sand slick with sweat, and sometimes blood from training accidents. The sword was no longer just a weapon in his hand, it was a tool his body had been re-engineered to wield. Sleep came in brief 4-hour intervals on the straw mattresses that smelled of the bodies that had occupied them before. When dreams came, they were fragmented memories of a life that felt more distant and unreal with every passing day. The boy began to forget the sound of his mother's voice, the scent of his village, and the simple feeling of making choices about how to spend his time. Memory became a luxury he could no longer afford. After 3 months of relentless training, he could kill a man in 6 different ways with a sword, disable an opponent with his bare hands, and endure pain that once would have made him weep. But the most profound transformation was invisible. He no longer wondered about escape. He no longer dreamed of a life outside the school. His world had shrunk to the confines of the Gladiator Academy. His future was reduced to the next day's training, and his identity was now defined by the approval or disapproval of his masters. The boy had been replaced by something far more useful. The conditioning was complete. 3 months after the branding iron had marked him as property, the boy who had long since forgotten his birth name had learned to call his owner father, and his fellow slaves brothers. The language of kinship had become the language of ownership. The boy's Germanic accent had faded under the weight of the Latin. Commands shouted daily from dawn until dusk. His shoulders had broadened from lifting stone weights. His hands, once soft as a farmer's, now bore permanent ridges from calluses that split and bled before hardening into the firm grip of a warrior. Yet the most profound change remained unseen. He no longer questioned whether he would escape. Marcus Crassus Aquila presided over evening meals as a patriarch might bless his household, walking between long tables where gladiators sat in ranked order, pausing to squeeze shoulders, offer words of encouragement, and distribute small rewards. An extra portion of meat, a cup of unmixed wine, a reprieve from dawn training. His voice carried genuine warmth when praising improvement and authentic disappointment when performance lagged. The boy, now called Ferox for his intensity during weapon drills, found himself craving these moments of recognition. When Aquila paused beside him to comment favourably on his shield work, warmth spread through Ferox's chest in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. When days passed without acknowledgement, he drove himself harder in training, seeking the return of that approval, like a man dying of thirst seeking water. The veteran gladiators had learned to navigate this artificial family structure with sophisticated understanding. They knew which emotional displays earned favour, which shows of loyalty were rewarded, and which demonstrations of brotherhood solidified their positions. Brutus, a Gaul who had survived 18 arena matches, took Ferox under his protection in a gesture that seemed generous, but actually served to elevate his own status as an elder brother. Competition for paternal attention was fierce, but hidden beneath displays of fraternal solidarity. Gladiators celebrated each other's victories while calculating how another's success might undermine their own standing. They shared food but hoarded small advantages. They offered comfort, yet measured weakness for future exploitation, and manipulation became indistinguishable. Aquila encouraged romantic attachments between gladiators and the female slaves who cooked, cleaned, and provided sexual services within the school. These relationships created additional bonds to the familiar, more reasons to remain loyal, and more vulnerabilities to exploit should rebellion ever cross their minds. Ferox found himself drawn to a Germanic girl named Silva, whose presence made the stone walls feel slightly less like a prison. Neither of them understood that their affection was as calculated as their diet. The school celebrated religious festivals with genuine enthusiasm. During Saturnalia, the social order temporarily inverted. Slaves served food to gladiators, trainers waited on their charges, and even Aquila performed menial tasks. These moments of role reversal created the illusion of choice and dignity, while subtly reinforcing the natural hierarchy. When the festival ended, and the natural order resumed, the contrast made their usual positions feel like gifts rather than burdens. Medical care at the school was abundant and sophisticated. The school physician, a Greek named Galen, treated injuries with techniques that would have impressed city doctors. Broken bones were set with precision wounds sutured with silk thread and infections treated with imported medicines. This care was not born of kindness but of practical necessity. Damaged gladiators were poor investments. Yet to men who had never known such treatment, it felt like love. Family dinners featured storytelling where veteran gladiators recounted their arena triumphs. These tales reframed moments of terror and brutality into narratives of courage and skill. Young gladiators absorbed these stories, learning to reframe their future suffering as potential glory. The propaganda was more effective because it came from brothers rather than masters. When gladiators died in training or in the arena, funerals were elaborate affairs. Aquila spoke of their courage, their dedication to the familiar, their honor in service. Tears were real grief, authentic, but the ceremonies also served to enshrine death as the highest expression of loyalty, making martyrdom appear beautiful rather than tragic. Ferox discovered that he would die to protect the family that had been constructed to ensure his death. The bonds felt real because the emotions were genuine, even if the structure was artificial. He loved his father, who had purchased him, his brothers, who competed with him, and his woman who belonged to the same master. Love had become the strongest chain of all. 6 months after his purchase, the boy who now answered to Ferox stood in the holding area beneath the Colosseum, feeling the crowd's hunger vibrate through the stone walls. The gladius, the same sword Ferox had practiced with 10,000 times against straw targets, this goal felt different now. It was no longer just a piece of steel, it was an instrument that would taste human blood instead of vegetable fibers. Silva, the Germanic girl, had braided a leather cord around his wrist that morning, a gesture that felt both like a blessing and a curse. She belonged to the same master, lived within the same compound, and existed in the same system that had manufactured their love just as efficiently as it had shaped his killing skills. The cord carried the scent of the olive oil she used to clean wounds in the infirmary. Ferox's opponent, Demetrius, a Thracian seasoned by 5 previous arena appearances, was 3 years older. They had shared meals at the gladiator school, trained together, and even laughed at the same crude jokes told by the veteran fighters. Now they faced each other across 20 feet of sand, armed with weapons designed for each other's destruction. The editor of the games, a politician seeking popular favor, raised his white cloth. The crowd fell silent with anticipation, a tension so intense it bordered on sexual. Ferox could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of sand beneath his feet, and the leather creaking as Demetrius shifted his grip on his curved seeker. Time seemed to move like honey in winter. The cloth dropped. Demetrius moved first, his curved blade seeking the gap between shield and armor at Ferox's side. Training took over. Ferox's shield deflected the strike, and his gladius thrust toward the Thracian's exposed ribs. Steel rang against steel. The crowd released its collective breath in a sigh of satisfaction. They circled under the afternoon sun, each seeking an advantage, testing defenses, learning each other's rhythms. This was no chaotic brawl. It was a calculated dance of professionals, each cut delivered with precision, each block timed to perfection. Every feint was designed to create an opening that would end the performance. Demetrius stumbled, whether from fatigue or strategy, Ferox could not tell. His shield dropped 6 inches, exposing the hollow of his throat. For less than a second, Ferox's gladius moved without conscious thought, sliding between collarbones, severing arteries, finding the space where life resided. Blood sprayed across the sand, painting geometric patterns. Demetrius's eyes widened with surprise, not pain, as if he could not believe that this was the moment of transition from performer to sacrifice. He tried to speak, but only blood emerged, carrying words that would never be completed. The crowd erupted in approval, so loud that Ferox felt it like a physical blow in his chest. They were on their feet, arms raised, voices unified in their appreciation of his skill. The sound was intoxicating, more powerful than wine, more addictive than the opium gladiators sometimes used to dull pain. For the first time since his capture, Ferox felt the crowd's love wash over him like a warm tide. Demetrius collapsed into the sand, his body twitching twice before lying still. The Thracian who had taught Ferox to sharpen his blade shared his meat during illness, and spoken tenderly of his sister in distant Thrace became meat cooling under the Roman sun. The editor gestured in approval. Attendants dressed as Charon entered to retrieve the body, dragging it toward the gate of death, while the crowd's attention had already shifted to the next pairing. Demetrius was a memory before his blood had finished soaking into the sand. Ferox raised his bloody gladius toward the Imperial box where the Empress sat in purple silk. The gesture was automatic, learned through countless hours of training, but the emotion behind it was genuine. He felt gratitude towards the system that had given him this moment of transcendence, this taste of what it meant to be more than a slave. Walking back through the gate of life, still hearing the echoes of acclamation, Ferox understood that he had crossed a threshold more significant than the one between the arena and the holding area. He had become someone who could take a human life and feel elevated by it, not diminished. The crowd's approval had transformed murder into accomplishment, brutality into art. That night, as he cleaned his equipment in the gladiator school, Ferox realized he was already looking forward to his next performance. 2 years after his first kill, 18 months after his 10th vendors outside the Colosseum began selling oil lamps bearing Ferox's image. The ceramic depicted him in the moment of triumph, Gladius' raised foot planted on the chest of a defeated opponent whose face was deliberately left vague, allowing the lamp to commemorate any of his kills. Children throughout Rome played with wooden figurines carved in his likeness, reenacting battles that had left real men dead in sand that sparkled with powdered gold. The scars that now mapped his torso told stories every citizen knew by heart. The puckered line across his ribs from a Thracian's desperate thrust in his 3rd match. The pale tissue on his shoulder from a German's axe in his 7th. Each mark was a chapter in a biography written in pain, transformed into entertainment more valuable than the flesh that bore it. The transformation had been gradual but absolute. Each victory brought refinements to his public image, moving him further from the Germanic boy who had been sold in the Forum. A professional artist painted his portrait on the wall of a popular tavern, adding scars he did not possess, and muscles more heroic than anatomy allowed. Poets composed verses celebrating his courage, verses that bore no resemblance to the calculating brutality required for survival in the arena. Women from senatorial families sent gifts to his cell, silk garments, bottles of expensive perfume poems written in their own hands, expressing admiration for his prowess. These offerings were displayed publicly, marking him as an object of desire for the empire's elevated citizens. The irony that these same women would never acknowledge his existence outside the arena was lost in the intoxication of their attention. Marcus Crassus Aquila discovered that Ferox's fame was more valuable than his fighting ability. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices to attend private exhibitions where Ferox demonstrated combat techniques against condemned criminals. These intimate performances allowed the elite to examine the celebrity gladiator up close, to touch the scars that marked his body and feel vicarious contact with controlled danger. The crowd had learned his preferences and anticipated his signature moves. When he entered the arena, 50,000 voices chanted his name in unison. The sound seemed to lift him above the sand, above the stone walls, above his circumstances. In those moments, surrounded by adoration that felt like worship, it became impossible to remember that love and imprisonment were not mutually exclusive. His cell was relocated to a private one, and the chains of his enslavement were adorned with the golden glow of celebrity. Ferox's quarters in the gladiator school were furnished with a real bed decorated with gifts from admirers and equipped with luxuries that elevated him above his fellow slaves. The comfort was real, but it also served to separate him from potential allies and make him complicit in his own captivity through privilege that would vanish if he ever resisted the system. Younger gladiators sought his guidance with the reverence typically reserved for religious figures. They studied his techniques, imitated his mannerisms, and competed for the smallest acknowledgement from the man whose success had proven that elevation within the system was possible. Ferox found himself dispensing wisdom about combat survival and the management of crowd psychology, as if these skills were noble, not just necessary for survival. Betting on his matches became so popular that odds makers hired mathematicians to calculate probabilities based on his opponent's fighting style, physical condition, and psychological state. Ferox's body became the foundation for a complex economic system, employing hundreds of people, bookmakers, odds calculators, and information brokers who sold details about his training to interested gamblers. His death, they all knew, would collapse multiple businesses. The emperor himself requested a private audience during which Ferox was praised for bringing honor to the empire through his skill and dedication. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but being acknowledged by the supreme authority of the known world created a sense of validation that ran deeper than reason. He had been seen recognized and elevated to imperial attention. The slave who had once been branded like livestock now basked in the approval of a god. Merchants throughout the empire used his image to sell products that had nothing to do with gladiatorial combat. Wine sellers claimed their vintage gave men the strength of ferox. Weaponsmiths advertised blades forged in the style favoured by the great gladiator. Brothel owners named their most attractive slaves after him. His identity had been packaged and distributed as a commodity more valuable than his actual self. The fame that seemed like freedom was in truth the most sophisticated form of captivity ever devised. Every cheer from the crowd was another link in the chains made of adoration. Every gift from an admirer was another reason to remain grateful for his circumstances. Every poem written in his honour was another layer of false identity that buried the boy who had once possessed a different name in a different world. Ferox understood with the clarity that comes only in the dark hours before dawn that his celebrity had made escape impossible. He could not flee Rome because his face was carved in marble throughout the city. He could not blend into crowds because his scars told stories that every citizen knew by heart. He could not disappear because his absence would be noticed by thousands of people who believed they loved him. He was the most famous slave in the empire, and therefore the most perfectly imprisoned man who had ever lived. 6 years after the auctioneer had declared him sold 43 arena appearances after his first kill, the accumulated damage was reaching its mathematical conclusion. Ferox's left knee shattered by a mace blow in his 28th match and never properly healed, sent lightning through his leg every time he pivoted. His sword arm weakened by tendons severed and re-stitched. In his 35th victory, trembled with fatigue after prolonged combat. The crowd that had loved him since his spectacular debut against Demetrius the Thracian sensed weakness with the instinct of creatures bred to watch death. Their voices changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent, as 50,000 people leaned forward to observe the first signs that their entertainment was nearing its climax. The cut across his thigh, deeper than intended, was a sign. His opponent Cush, the Nubian gladiator, had learned to read weakness as Ferox had once learned to read the spacing between shield and armour. The dark stains spreading across white linen wrapped around his wounds were souvenirs from men who had tried to kill him and failed until now. This was the moment when failure was no longer an option. Ferox had survived 43 arena appearances across 6 years. His body was a map of accumulated damage bones that had been broken and reset muscles that had been torn and restitched scars that formed patterns as complex as military decorations. Each mark represented a moment when he had chosen survival over surrender, when he had pulled victory from the embrace of defeat. But the accumulation was reaching its end. The editor of the games, a consul seeking to commemorate his son's coming of age, had paid extraordinary sums to ensure that this match would be remembered. The sand had been mixed with powdered gold catching the afternoon light. Musicians stationed around the arena provided orchestral accompaniment to the combat. Professional mourners waited in the wings to perform elaborate death songs. If the crowd's favourite fell, Cush struck again. His curved blade opened another line across Ferox's sword arm, and blood ran down the gladius handle, making Ferox's grip uncertain. The crowd's roar intensified, but not with joy. Instead, it was the complex emotion of spectators watching their investment face destruction. They loved him, but they loved the drama of his potential death more. The wound was not fatal, but it was decisive. Ferox's attacks became defensive. His footwork, once as precise as a dancer's, grew clumsy. The gladius, once an extension of his will, became a burden he could barely lift. Cush pressed his advantage with professional courtesy, delivering cuts designed to weaken rather than kill, extending the performance until the audience reached peak engagement. When Ferox finally fell, it was with the grace that 6 years of training had instilled in him. He rolled to absorb the impact, kept his shield raised even as his knee touched the sand, and maintained the dignity his admirers expected even in defeat. The crowd fell silent, not the expectant quiet before the climax, but the reverent hush that accompanies sacred moments. Cush stood above him, blade raised. Waiting for the signal that would decide whether mercy or death would conclude the performance, the editor rose from his seat, consulting the crowd's will through gestures honed over centuries of such moments. Thumbs extended some up, some down, creating a visual democracy of death. The calculation was complex. Ferox's fame made him valuable alive, but his accumulated injuries suggested his useful life was drawing to an end. His defeat today had been decisive enough to satisfy honor, but close enough to maintain dignity. The crowd's bloodlust was aroused, but not yet fully sated. The mathematics of entertainment demanded resolution. The editor's thumb turned downwards, and Cush's blade found the gap between neck and shoulder with the precision of a surgeon. The cut was clean and deep, designed to end consciousness before pain could even register. Ferox's blood poured into the sand which had absorbed the life of 10,000 men before him, each death carefully orchestrated just like his own. The crowd erupted in appreciation, a mixture of mourning and celebration. They had witnessed artistry, the perfect conclusion to a career that had provided years of reliable entertainment. Musicians began the death songs that transformed brutality into beauty that gave meaning to meaninglessness, making murder feel like sacrifice. Attendants dressed as Mercury entered to verify the completeness of death, prodding the body with heated iron rods to ensure no deception. Others dressed as Charon prepared to ferry the corpse to whatever processing awaited beyond the gate of death. The theatrical elements continued even after consciousness had ended. The body that had once been Ferox was dragged across sand that sparkled with gold dust, leaving a dark trail that caught the light like a comet's tail. The crowd watched until the gate closed, then shifted their attention to the next pairing, the next possibility for transcendent violence, the next opportunity to witness transformation through death. In the holding areas beneath the arena, gladiators who had known Ferox cleaned their weapons and prepared for their own performances. His death was a reminder of their eventual fate, but also proof that fame, skill, and crowd approval could sustain a man for years before the mathematics of mortality claimed their due. The show continued without pause. The system required fresh performances, new heroes, and different endings to the same eternal story. Ferox had played his role with professional excellence, but the system had outlived him and would outlive all his successors. His death had been perfect entertainment. The body that had cost Marcus Crassus a killer 120 denarii 6 years earlier was processed with efficiency that would have impressed military quartermasters. The boy who had once possessed a different name in a different world had become 180 pounds of valuable commodity in an empire that wasted nothing, especially nothing that had drawn crowds and generated revenue during life. The blood that had carried his consciousness for 22 years was collected in bronze vessels while still warm from arterial flow. Silver, the Germanic girl who had braided leather cords around his wrists before every match was assigned, to wash the vessels clean after physicians had sold the contents to epileptics who believed consuming gladiator vitality could cure their affliction. Her tears mixed with water that ran red down the drainage channels. But the system had no mechanism for processing grief. The blood still warm from arterial flow was collected in bronze vessels and sold to epileptics who believed consuming gladiator vitality could cure their affliction. Physicians recommended the treatment with straight faces, prescribing doses measured to the dram, and charging fees that reflected the perceived potency of blood spilled in heroic circumstances. The liquid that had carried Ferox's consciousness became medicine for strangers who never learned his name. His flesh was butchered by professionals who understood anatomy as precisely as any surgeon. Certain cuts were reserved for ritual consumption. Senators paid premium prices for gladiator steak, believing the meat carried courage that could be absorbed through digestion. The muscle that had wielded sword and shield became a delicacy for palates sophisticated enough to taste bravery. The bones were processed through mills that reduced them to powder as fine as flour. Apothecaries mixed gladiator bone meal with honey to create ointments supposedly capable of healing wounds, restoring virility, and extending life. The calcium that had supported 6 years of arena combat was transformed into folk remedies sold in amphorae, marked with symbols that promised strength and endurance. His skin was treated with chemicals that preserved its scars and was sold to collectors who displayed strips of gladiator hide like trophies. The largest section, bearing the wound that had killed him, was purchased by a wealthy merchant who mounted it in his atrium beside other curiosities from the empire's far reaches. Visitors could touch the scar tissue and claim a connection to legendary courage. The gladiator school held a funeral ceremony that transformed Ferox's death into inspiration for the surviving fighters. Marcus Crassus Aquila delivered a eulogy that praised dedication, skill, and honor, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that the system itself bore responsibility for the loss. The speech became a template for future memorials refined through repetition until every gladiator's death could be framed as a noble sacrifice. Within months, street performers throughout Rome began reenacting Ferox's famous battles with theatrical flair that bore no resemblance to the brutal reality of actual combat. Children played games where they competed to portray the hero, arguing over who could most accurately imitate his signature moves. The performances grew more elaborate with each retelling, adding elements of magic and divine intervention that elevated human suffering to mythological status. Poets composed epic verses that placed Ferox among legendary heroes, figures who had never existed. His Germanic origins were romanticized into noble lineage, and his slavery was reframed as voluntary service to Roman glory. His deaths of other gladiators became merciful releases granted to unworthy opponents. The boy who had been weighed like grain became a demigod through literary revision. Artists carved his image into public monuments, but the face they sculpted bore no resemblance to the actual features that had been destroyed by years of combat. The marble Ferox was idealized, perfected, transformed into a symbol rather than a memorial. Citizens who had cheered his death walked past statues that commemorated a person who had never existed, honoring fiction while forgetting the truth. The gladiator school's official records were edited to enhance the legend. Scribes added victories that had never occurred, described techniques that defied physics, and attributed wisdom that reflected literary imagination rather than battlefield experience. Future historians would write about Ferox based on these falsified documents, ensuring that even scholarly accounts would perpetuate the mythology. His former cell was converted into a shrine, where visitors could purchase blessed oils, protective amulets, and miniature weapons supposedly modelled after his personal equipment. The space where he had struggled with doubt, pain, and the gradual erosion of identity became a tourist attraction that generated revenue for the school that had orchestrated his destruction. Decades later, when new generations of gladiators rose to prominence, their achievements were measured against Ferox's manufactured legacy. They competed not just with living opponents, but with ghostly standards inflated beyond human possibility. The myth had become a heavier burden than the reality ever had been. The most profound transformation was the gradual erasure of the system's responsibility for his death. Cultural memory preserved his courage while forgetting his captivity, celebrated his skill while ignoring his slavery, honored his legend while erasing the machinery that had consumed his life. He became an example of Roman virtues rather than a victim of Roman cruelty. The boy who had been purchased for 20 denarii, who had learned to kill for crowd approval, and who had discovered that fame was the most sophisticated form of imprisonment, disappeared entirely. In his place stood a legend that served the system more effectively than the living man ever had. Even in death, he remained property of the empire that had consumed him. 3 days after the boy from Germany had bled out in sand mixed with powdered gold slave traders, returned to the forum with new inventory. The profit from Ferox's career ticket sales betting percentages, merchandising rights, and the final auction of his body parts had funded the purchase of 12 new slaves at prices reflecting the inflated gladiator market. Each boy would undergo the same conditioning protocols that had transformed the Germanic farmer's son into a Roman entertainer, the same psychological techniques that had manufactured loyalty from captivity, the same systematic elimination of choice that had proven reliable across decades of operation. Marcus Crassus. Quillus walked among the offerings with practiced eyes, seeking the physical attributes that had made his previous investment profitable. Broad shoulders, dense bone structure, the kind of reflexes that suggested survival potential. Age young enough for extended training, old enough for immediate utility. The criteria had not changed because human anatomy remained constant across generations. The bidding patterns followed familiar rhythms. Other Lenistae recognized the same qualities Aquilus valued, driving prices upward through competition that benefited sellers while treating buyers as economic units. A Gallic boy who resembled the young Ferox sold for 130 denarii inflation, adjusted for the dead gladiator's proven model. The market had learned from its successes at the gladiator school. New arrivals underwent the same conditioning protocols that had transformed the Germanic slave into an arena performer. Physical training was designed to build specific muscle groups. Nutritional regimens were calculated to optimize performance, and psychological techniques were refined through decades of converting humans into entertainers willing to die for crowd approval. The methods required no modification because they had demonstrated reliable effectiveness. The hierarchy among gladiators absorbed newcomers through established mechanisms. Veterans who had learned brutality from Ferox now taught those same lessons to fresh slaves, passing down techniques for survival and strategies for earning approval. Cruelty distributed itself through the ranks, automatically requiring no oversight from Roman trainers who could focus on other aspects of the operation. In the arena, crowds welcomed new performers with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for ferox. The entertainment value did not depend on individual personalities, but on the systematic production of combat skills, dramatic tension, and carefully orchestrated death. Names changed, faces varied, but the core product remained consistent across seasons and years. Children throughout the Empire continued playing gladiator games, but their reenactments now featured current fighters rather than the legendary ferox. Cultural memory proved shorter than the system's capacity for self-renewal. New heroes emerged to capture the imagination previously devoted to the dead champion, ensuring continued public investment in arena entertainment without requiring mourning periods that might dampen enthusiasm. The economic infrastructure that had been built on Ferox's back continued to thrive, perpetuating the system that had once created him, and now sustained itself on the legacy he had left behind. The systems that had supported Ferox's career adapted seamlessly to new stars. Betting systems transferred algorithms from analyzing his fighting style to predicting outcomes for his successors. Merchants replaced his image on their products with fresher faces, representing current rather than historical violence. The machinery of commodified brutality continued operating without interruption. Roman senators' daughters sent gifts to new gladiator cells expressing the same admiration for masculine violence that had elevated Ferox to celebrity status. The letters contained identical phrases, identical form fantasies, and identical mechanisms for transforming murderers into objects of aristocratic desire. Romance, like everything else in the system, followed reproducible patterns. Provincial cities built arenas modelled after the Colosseum, each requiring its own supply of gladiators trained according to Roman methods. The system expanded geographically, while maintaining consistency of function, spreading the infrastructure of normalized cruelty throughout territories, where local populations learned to cheer for choreographed death. Empire, in this sense, meant exporting not just laws and language, but entertainment built on human sacrifice. Military campaigns continued to produce the raw material captives who could be processed into gladiators through techniques perfected on countless previous subjects. Wars served multiple purposes, but one consistent function was feeding the arena system with fresh bodies that could be transformed into performers. Conquest and entertainment formed a symbiotic relationship that justified expansion through popular demand for new spectacles. The emperor who had praised Ferox died of natural causes, replaced by successors who maintained identical policies regarding gladiatorial games. Political leadership changed, but the institutional commitment to arena entertainment remained constant across dynasties embedded too deeply in Roman culture to be affected by mere changes in personnel. The system had achieved independence from individual decision-makers. Decades passed, centuries passed. The Roman Empire itself eventually collapsed, but by then the concept of organized violence as mass entertainment had spread throughout human civilization. Different cultures developed variations on the theme, but the core principle transforming human suffering into popular spectacle proved remarkably durable across time, geography, and political systems. Modern societies created their own versions of the arena, adapting ancient techniques to contemporary technologies while preserving the essential function, the systematic conversion of individual tragedy into collective entertainment. The machinery evolved, but its appetite remained constant. The boy who had been sold for 20 denarii was forgotten, but the system that had consumed him continued operating under different names in different languages, serving audiences who believed themselves more civilized than the Romans, while participating in identical transactions. The machine required flesh, and flesh was always available for the right price. Cruelty had become ordinary not through chaos, but through structure that outlived all its participants. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.